Am I making Zuckerman richer? I mean, did you? This is a really unpleasant thought.
All of us are making Zuckerman
I might ask that, actually. I'd like to ask that on
Ask Zoe that question.
Yeah.
Actually, Ian's been doing it longer. He'll be able to fully explain everything.
Yeah. I'll ask. I go on Facebook. I want to know why. I'll say I'm very worried about Facebook. So this jumped on me.
That word confused. What is this? Oh, this is doing something weird. Hello, welcome to Facebook. We're joined by Ian, who's concentrating, Zoe, who isn't concentrating, and Peter Oborne, who's obviously a very bad influence and is new to the show.
Totally concentrating. This is my concentrating face.
We were here, obviously, initially because of Brexit, but another story's emerged out of Westminster, and that is Julian Assange. So we were...
Yeah, Brexit, that's not happening anymore. We're moving on.
So we've seen images of him being carried out of the Ecuadorian embassy with a beard, not the sort of diplomatic exit we might have expected.
Yeah, I think it's terrific. I'm really, really excited by it. I think it's a rare piece of good news. And it's extraordinary. This thing's been going on for 7 years. It's like a sort of John and Yoko bed-in situation lasting for 7 years. I think he's a figure with a lot of questions to answer. I'm delighted that justice is now going to take its course.
I mean, people are asking, you know, why did he have to be taken out in a wheelchair? Or why couldn't he walk out? You know, is this him trying to control the optics in his kind of characteristically weird way? I think the impact of staying in one room for 7 years does take quite a physical toll on you, and he looks absolutely shocking.
He does. The Ecuadorians have talked about how he's tried to block cameras inside. They've questioned his behaviour. They're using that as one of the reasons why they've asked him to leave or they allowed the police in. What's your view on it, Peter?
Well, I speaking as a journalist and somebody who believes in free speech, it's not been jumped on us. I mean, you know, I just had this news. We came in here expecting to talk about Brexit. But my initial thought is as follows, that Julian Assange, you've got to make a decision if you believe in free speech or not. Now, Mr. Martin here, right, it doesn't. I do. And I feel very strongly that Mr. Assange broke more stories of high importance, hugely important stories, published them. We all owe him a huge amount of gratitude for doing that. He's exposed his work has exposed the truth about how foreign offices work up and down the world. I'm very, very concerned to see him being pulled out of anywhere. I hope he must, under no circumstances whatever, be allowed to go anywhere near the United States of America. He'll never come back again. I don't trust the American justice system to treat him fairly. And I think this is a matter which will define each and every one of us as journalists. He's defined himself as a non-journalist, as an anti-journalist, somebody who's opposed to free speech. I'm defining myself as somebody... Assange is a difficult man. I never met him. People I've met say who've met him who say he's awful. I don't care. He's a journalist. That's what I do.
I'm going to let Ian defend himself in just a moment, but a lot of people will agree with you in terms of his early work, but then he went on a completely different tangent, and he certainly didn't represent free speech after a while. The early stories, perhaps he did, and that's your view, isn't it, Zoe?
Really, he did actually become quite authoritarian over time, and that he went on a very strange journey intellectually and ideologically, in that he started out, exactly as you say, trying to speak truth to power, trying to hold Foreign Office feet to the fire, etc. And there was huge benefit to be had from that. But I think there was that inflection point. I think the Swedish rape accusation did change his character and his outlook, and he became a poster boy for the alt-right, partly because he was that in his kind of new ideological iteration.
I've defined myself as being on the side of good journalism. There's a difference.
Yeah, because I'm on the side of
what Peter fails to appreciate is that it is not high-quality journalism to simply take that information entirely out of context. We're going to have another.
Welcome to CNN Talk. We're coming to you from Westminster, where Brexit isn't the only story today. In fact, the much bigger story is that Julian Assange has been carried out of the Ecuadorian embassy. because he's been arrested. This is in response, we've recently heard in the last few minutes, partly because there's a US extradition request out for him. We're joined by Peter Oborne today, as well as Zoe and with Ian. We're going to be speaking to our various correspondents following this story as well. I'm going to start with you, Peter, because you stand out as a defender on this panel of Julian Assange and how you're very concerned about what happened today.
Yeah, Mr. Martin on my left earlier said he was taking out the champagne. I'm a journalist. I've never met Mr. Assange, and the story's been jumped on us, and I actually don't know very much about him. Although because of this, I actually was trying to go and see him because I was aware this might happen, but I didn't manage to do that. And I believe in free speech. I know it's unfashionable these days. There are huge forces against it, but I've heard lots of bad stories about Mr. Assange. But as far as I'm concerned, he's published loads, an amazing number of stories I would have given my eye teeth for. And if I travel a lot, I go to foreign countries a lot, and it's fascinating. Before you go, you read the State Department cables, and they are mind-boggling. They expose the hypocrisy of Western, Russian, Chinese, any foreign policy. What's really going on? You in CNN ought to be really interested, and you ought to hope that CNN, I'm expecting CNN to come out very strongly on a matter of principle of free speech in favour of Mr. Assange.
OK, I'm going to come on to Ian in a moment, where you can sort of defend your case against what Peter's saying. But Zoe, your view is you were very sympathetic to Julian Assange early on and probably would share the view that Peter's expressed, but it changed. Originally,
when he did that huge information dump, it was extreme. You know, The Guardian published it. We got a load of flack for it, but for kind of endangering lives, which was legitimate. But in the end, you came down on
because agents were named as part of the list.
I think they were. Well, I think that was the accusation against Snowden.
You could extrapolate, and it was the same accusation against WikiLeaks, that you could extrapolate who was who. I mean, whether or not you could, I do not know, but that was the accusation at the time. And I came down very strongly on Peter's side that it was actually, if you waited for the authorities to tell you what you were allowed to print, then that wasn't journalism. The really interesting thing, when he went into... So when this Swedish rape allegation was made, and he immediately thought it was an American conspiracy and went into hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy. I remember covering that story, and the people outside the embassy protesting on his behalf were all at that point radical lefties. They were people saying, this is a government conspiracy, this is the UK government, American government stitching up a completely false case in order to accuse him and kind of take him out of the scene. Actually, over time, what's happened is that he's started to ally himself against the left, with the forces against the left, you know, namely and most notably Donald Trump. So now that put his defenders, like John Pilger, in a completely unfamiliar space. They didn't know what they were defending or why, and he seemed to take a really different ideological journey. Whether or not that means he's more or less guilty is a different matter.
The Foreign Secretary today saying he's hidden from the truth for years, saying he doesn't represent truth and the free press at all.
Yeah, I take a different view of journalism to Peter. I don't think that it is responsible journalism to simply collect as much information as you can and then dump it entirely out of context, endangering Western security. The information should be, as all good journalism is, as practiced by CNN, by any responsible journalistic organisation, freedom of speech is not the right to shout fire in a theatre. You take the information, you assess its accuracy, you weigh it against other information, you ask those involved to respond, and you do have conflicting duties of responsibility. Of course you have a responsibility to get the truth out, but what Zoe illustrated there with Assange is the way in which he has fallen out with so many of his initial supporters illustrates the deep character flaw. Peter says he doesn't know very much about him. Well, there are a few people in the Western world who have had more written about them in the last more than a decade. I would recommend to anyone watching this programme and anyone with doubts about the story to read the magnificent long essay by Andrew O'Hagan, a journalist of the left who was initially commissioned to write a book with Assange, and it's his very long account of his process of disaffection and his coming to the conclusion that he was dealing with, in effect, a charlatan and an egomaniac. And I think that's why I think ultimately he's been, so many people who initially supported him have rumbled him.
Let us know what you think. Do you agree with any of the panel, in fact? You might have your own views. Sue says absolutely awful news. Linda says bring him to the US. David says Assange is not a hero, he's a zero. And Ivan says now maybe we'll get answers to all the damaging work done by his leaks, even.
This is what... Can I just say that I've listened to what both my distinguished panellists on this panel have said. Your view, Zoe, appears to be that he changed from the... He'd gone from the thing on the left, which was good, to the alt-right, which was bad. I, again, take the free speech view that whatever he's on your alt-right or on the left, he's fully entitled to express his views, whether or not you disagree with them.
Peter, let's remember, he's not being arrested for having views. He's being arrested for outstanding rape allegations.
But he's not, actually. The Swedish charges are being dropped.
Yeah.
This is a separate US extradition request.
This is very cynical. Look, I don't believe for a single moment that the US will give him a fair trial. If he goes to the US, he's going to stay in the US in some sort of...
But wait a second. Part of the arrest charge is a British charge for him evading justice, which dates back to the Swedish charges. So even if the Swedish charges have been dropped,
that's true.
the British thing is still to do with Sweden.
But then the US case will be taken into account as a result.
Yes, of course it will, but Zoe's absolutely right. I mean, that is the British government's excuse. Well, that's the cover for going in today.
Okay.
But it's another example of just he's managed to fall out with the Ecuadorians as well. Everyone is trying to help this guy.
I like the fact this man, who I've never met, falls out with people. I'm strongly in favour of falling out with people. It's normally a good sign.
I've noticed that. I've certainly never noticed.
You wouldn't get that impression from this panel. Let's speak to Nina Dos Santos. She's outside the embassy. He did have an extraordinary life there, didn't he? What do you understand was the thing that broke it for him in the end?
Well, I can tell you anecdotally, yesterday I went to a WikiLeaks press conference during which they unveiled a whole series of allegations of a high-intensity spying operation upon Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy. And the CEO of WikiLeaks also alleged that they had been approached or managed to get in contact with a middleman based in Spain who basically, according to them, was going to blackmail them for €3 million. Otherwise, they were going to give all of this information to the police. They were accusing the current Ecuadorian president, I should say, not just the country itself, of mounting a spying operation that filmed Julian Assange during his medical visits with doctors. They showed us journalists pictures of that. They also claimed that his legal meetings with his defense counsel had been spied upon, etc., etc. And apparently the Ecuadorians had not actually been informed that WikiLeaks was planning on unveiling any of this material here. So you can imagine that probably blindsided the Ecuadorians. And then later on today, what we're expecting, Max, is the Foreign Secretary of Ecuador to give a statement about the case, Julian Assange's case, to Ecuador's own parliament. So today was always going to be a dramatic day. Towards the end of last week, what we saw was WikiLeaks tweeting that they believed, according to quote-unquote high-level Ecuadorian sources of theirs, that Assange could have been expelled from the embassy within hours or possibly days. Well, it seems as though it has been days. We saw, as you said in your earlier introduction, this bearded Assange being dragged out of the embassy in video footage that has emerged online. I should say that one of the online broadcasters has had a feed up monitoring the exit of the Ecuadorian embassy ever since WikiLeaks tweeted that he would be expelled a few days ago. So this seems to have been something that WikiLeaks was potentially prepared for, and also the statements from the British government have changed as well, because remember that the UK has had to spend millions of pounds here mounting surveillance on the Ecuadorian embassy, having police officers ready to arrest Assange if he were to walk out and end his asylum here. Eventually those police officers were invited in after Ecuador decided to rescind its asylum after 7 years for Assange. But this is a situation that both the UK and other parties, including the new government of Ecuador, had been wanting to bring to an end for quite some time. It obviously ended in a fairly dramatic fashion, Max. What we're going to expect later on today, obviously, is going to be him appearing before Westminster Magistrates Court, possibly. And then we're expecting the Home Secretary to make a statement, potentially even before then. So that is significant.
Lots of support coming in, thank you, Nina, on Facebook for Assange. Carlos says this is a terrible day for Britain. Ali says Assange is underrated. Jamie says Assange was a hero exposing war crimes. Then he became a very partisan against the left. But again, to your point, his politics shouldn't necessarily undo what he did in terms of media exposure.
What I'm saying is that I want to know why he's been arrested. There are a lot of questions about this. Is Jeremy Hunt turning into the new Tony Blair, doing what, jumping to the tune of the United States? There's a big issue there. Is he put the poodle to Donald Trump? That's what I'm worried about. The Britain has become a poodle to the US foreign policy.
But do we expect Donald Trump is pro-WikiLeaks?
Exactly. Donald Trump is very pro-WikiLeaks, partly because of that information.
Has he ever said that?
Yeah, he said, I love WikiLeaks,
That was before he
WikiLeaks.
became elected. I think it was...
Yeah, but he
I
said...
studied his tweets. They've changed.
To be honest, I think
he's probably
if he
not going to say
plays-
much today.
I know this is maybe a little bit lateral, but I think Julian Assange, if he played a more strategic game, when immediately after Trump had been elected, he should have left the Ecuadorian embassy of his own accord. I don't think Trump would have sought extradition processes against him just after his election because of that huge wiki dump, which in Trump's eyes discredited Hillary Clinton. I think if he'd maximised his advantage and that campaign trail support from Trump, he'd be fine now. He'd probably be in Horseferry Road facing a £60 fine for evasion of arrest 7 years ago.
Instead, we've got these optics of him being dragged out of the embassy with a beard. Do you think he would have encouraged that sort of imagery because he could have walked?
Yeah, well, this is consistent with his entire career, his approach to attention-seeking, this personality cult, which initially attracted a lot of people to him. He's clearly a very charismatic individual with a gift for, for media optics. We find it makes interesting.
How does that work for him?
Television.
The establishment's out to get him, all of that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he's rallied. There's a small group of supporters, and there aren't that many Assange supporters. He was very, very popular
there's quite a
10
few on
years ago.
Facebook
Very popular
today.
10 years ago.
But the
And a
ones
lot
that
less
there
popular
are,
now.
it is really telling that the only people to get that footage are Ruptly, which is a Russian news agency who obviously had a tip-off.
But-
Now, he is in cahoots with Putin in some way.
And I get that conspiracy theory, and there's a lot of it going around. But to be fair, a lot of the TV networks have been based down there for a few days ever since.
Well, why didn't you
WikiLeaks.
guys get it then?
Well, we were down there, but not at that
But
particular
nobody
moment.
had a phone.
I can't speak on behalf of CNN. But, anyone could have caught that, actually. But there are some conspiracy theories
But
about
it's
the Russian...
peculiar that only one Russian network even had a phone there, right?
Well, no, they've got quite a presence in London, the Russian networks, right?
No, but I mean, of all the other networks, nobody even had their mobile phone.
Can we get back to what is the issue we are actually discussing? He's been taken out. What is he charged with, and who wants him? Can we just summarise the
Well, all
statement?
we know is that there's been a US extradition request. The UK sort of arrest is based on he avoided being arrested in the UK, so that would be dealt with quite quickly, presumably, under the magistrates' court.
Begins
but then we've got the
yeah.
extradition request. We don't actually know what is the basis of that yet.
Yes. So the UK have arrested him, and then they were going to get an extradition request from the United States
and
of
then they'll
America.
consider that.
And this is why I am very alarmed. We don't want Mr. Assange even accepting all of the arguments made by Mr. Martin and Miss Williams here to go to the United States, where you won't get a fair trial. I've never seen any evidence that people have been killed as a result of his leaks. I've read his leaks. They've been a terrific service to public understanding of particularly American foreign policy. As a journalist, I regard that as a good thing, and it's very unsightly. It's very, very unsightly seeing the British state doing the dirty work of the United States.
It's also the Ecuadorians, though. The president has said today in a sovereign decision, Ecuador withdrew the asylum status to Julian Assange after his repeated violations to international conventions and daily life protocols.
Hasn't there been a change of regime in Ecuador?
There has, and there's been a change of ambassador as well in London.
I think Ecuador
I
is
don't
now
understand.
jumping to the United States chin as well. This is a very worrying moment for
I don't
any
understand
decent
what-
journalist, and he's not a decent journalist. He makes a distinction between good and bad journalists, and only good journalists can be treated, should be subject to the rule of law. That's your argument. It's a disgraceful argument.
Simply not what I said.
It is exactly
I
what you said.
Simply not what I said.
You said there was good journalists and there's bad journalists. journalism.
Of course there is.
Journalism
Of course
which you
there is.
approve and journalism of which you don't.
Of course.
And use that as a justification for what looks like
Of
disgrace.
course. So it's a basic journalistic practice.
To be honest.
Look, let's take another example.
Yeah.
If someone like me who's written about the financial crisis and the misbehaviour of banks, if I was to simply conclude that because of freedom of speech, I wanted to obtain the name of every single account and every single financial transaction of a bank's customers, and I simply dumped that, saying, look what all of these people are up to, would I have committed an act of good journalism? No, I wouldn't. It would have been highly irresponsible. You take the information, you weigh it, you assess it, you give people a right to reply, and you write about it intelligently. It is not journalism.
Where is the line
to
on
simply take piles of information and dump it on the internet?
For the public?
I mean, I find that quite convincing, I must say.
I think look, we're talking here mainly about State Department cables, and actually getting hold of those cables is a massive contribution to understanding. We're not talking people's private bank accounts. That's a different matter. It's a false comparison. State Department cables revealed again and again that what the Americans said they were doing in public was the opposite of what they were doing in private. There is a public interest in knowing that kind of thing. And that was a massive contribution, as I understand it.
But that, on that premise, you should be able to publish any Secret Service documents?
No, he didn't. As I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, there were no Secret Service documents at all in that dump. The accusation made against Snowden was a different one, that because he published Secret Service stuff, he was jeopardising the lives of agents.
Comfortable with the Snowden case?
I think
and that being redacted?
I have been convinced that the Snowden stuff jeopardised the lives of agents and therefore should not have happened.
Zoe, where are you on that?
I think that is true. I think there is a distinction between Snowden and Assange, and I think Snowden's case is more comfortable, more palatable to people with freedom of speech concerns. Well, I suppose what I'm interested in the Assange case, you're right. He is a weirdo and a creep. I think I can say that without any danger of being...
It's been said before.
It's been said by many
CNN
people.
view,
But, you know, there are kind of personality issues with him, and he doesn't fall out with people because he's a man of principle. He falls out with them because he's a weirdo and a creep, and that's kind of... You know, very, very decent people, journalists, have established that to my satisfaction.
But that's not a reason for hauling him out of
No, of course not. But, like, I don't think... I suppose what interests me now is where the case goes from here. I would be surprised, actually, if the extradition case were upheld. I don't think the British will extradite him. But furthermore, I would be very surprised if this case, if he got to America, if this case unfolded the way you're worried that it might. I don't think Trump would want a huge, in-depth examination of Julian Assange's actions, precisely because so much of it concerns Russian interference with elections, and precisely because so much of it could be used in a number of different ways.
We have obviously learnt from Mueller that, you know, there are no sort of proven links between
but, you know,
Trump and the Russians.
Maybe with another information dump.
Ali says, RIP, freedom of speech, and Fred says, surely he'll now have his day in court. Well, we are expecting that. There will be at least some sort of appearance in Magistrates' Court. He won't be expected to make any sort of speech there, but further down the line he might be. Let us know what you think about today's case. We'll be back in just a moment. There's lots of discussion about free speech, presumably because that's what you've been discussing as well. But that's where his support base comes from, isn't it? Especially in the modern world of fake news, they feel that he does represent something that's freer.
I think a lot of his support genuinely comes from these nutters.
So we're still on air, are we?
Yes, well, we're on Facebook currently.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, is he getting a cut for this?
I haven't asked
I don't
him.
like him much. I think he's bad news.
Well,
And we're on Facebook,
Well,
aren't
we're
we?
talking about free
I
speech.
wasn't told. I
so
was
you can
told
say
I
what
was
you
going
want.
on CNN, not on Facebook.
We're on CNN. We go on
Facebook is
Facebook
just
as
the
well to
platform.
I
receive...
know, but
It's just the
Zuckerberg, I don't
platform.
approve of him. He publishes the
You're
most
right
awful
for the
stuff.
Daily Mail, which has an extraordinarily close relationship with Facebook.
Well, tell us
Yes.
more. I'd like to know more about that. Because as far as I'm concerned,
look at the
Zuckerberg
website.
publishes inflammatory stuff which enables genocide. I've seen this stuff, and
take
I
this up with the
wasn't
I'll
told.
just make the point that we're not getting paid by
Yeah.
Facebook, so they're not making any money from us.
Anyway, I want to make my views. If I'm going on Facebook, you need to know what I think about it.
No, absolutely, especially on a debate about freedom of speech. Web publishers
Yeah, but
aren't journalists.
Freedom of speech does not embrace the freedom to give voices to racists and genocidal people.
So this is an interesting one from Samia saying web publishers aren't journalists. So this takes us into the whole debate around that as well, whether or not he should be regarded as a journalist.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were still on Facebook. I thought
We are on Facebook.
No, but no, I thought
Technically.
we were still talking about Facebook, and I thought that.
We're not anymore. We're
related
going to the
what-
TV show. We are in Westminster, where Julian Assange, down the road, has been arrested by the UK authorities. It's upset a lot of you online. A lot of people saying this is not the way to treat him. A lot of people saying that, this is absolutely right. They're following the rule of law. When it comes to the idea that he might be extradited to the United States, we can't speak for the US system. We don't really know what the charges are in the United States.
No.
But what do we know about the existing system of extradition between the UK and the US? Presumably it's easier to extradite from the UK than it is from other countries because of the close relations.
Generally speaking, if you look at all the kind of extradition controversies of recent years, people consider British justice to be too supine and too poodlish to the Americans. And that was the case. That's traditionally been the case, that somebody gets extradited and then punished extremely harshly
There
for
was a
crimes
very
that-
bad change in the law by the Blair government,
Yeah,
which basically
exactly.
gave preferential rights to the US
Yeah.
to extradite people from Britain. This is one of the issues which is going to come to light here, which is another reason why we need to fight to keep Assange in this country and out of the United States.
I think you're going to struggle for allies there, Peter, because, you have the constituency that just wants to do what America says. You have the constituency that
Including
thinks...
Jeremy Hunt, the
that
Foreign
thinks
Secretary.
Assange evaded justice in the first place and should face a different kind of justice just so that he's faced some justice. You have a constituency that thinks he's a kind of dangerous president. You have the kind of Ian Martin constituency that thinks he's an irresponsible, dangerous presence and it's not our responsibility to worry about him. You're going to struggle for allies in the defence of Julian Assange because he's left himself with very few friends.
We're going to bring in Hadass Gold because we want to bring clarity to your question about what exactly the charges might be that are laid before Julian Assange in court. I think the British ones are pretty clear-cut, aren't they, Hadass? But what do you understand the US extradition case to be?
Well, we first, Max, learned about this, possible charges against him in the United States, sort of through an error in a November filing where, I don't know if you all remember, but there seemed to be language inserted into a different filing that somehow was related to Assange. And recently, we just got a tweet a few minutes ago from Assange's lawyer saying that they do believe that there will be extradition request charges related to him in the United States. And you have to keep in mind what Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had said about Julian Assange and how they want him to face justice in the United States, and they consider WikiLeaks a hostile intelligence service. So we've seen those sort of talks ramping up over the past few months, obviously with the political situation in Ecuador changing, and then obviously today with the big news of Assange being arrested. We do know that the Home Secretary Sajid Javid is expected to make a statement to the House of Commons in the next 45 minutes or so, and I think that is rather unique in a situation like this, to have the Home Secretary make a statement in the House of Commons. That is leading many to believe that there will be something about an extradition request from the United States that will obviously watch what he says in the House of Commons and alludes to that. I also find it interesting, I heard some of you talking a little bit about this before, that the Russian network Ruktli, which is owned by RT, which is a Russian state-owned network, is one of the ones that has some of the only footage of him being arrested. And I saw tweets actually from one of their news directors, and she said that they were on 24-hour stakeouts outside of the embassy. They clearly were expecting some action to happen there. So I do find that very unique. I'm hoping to speak to do some more reporting about how they got that footage. But all of this, obviously, very exciting day in this Assange story. It's really stunning to see it sort of come to a head after 7 years like this, Max.
Yeah, OK, Hadass, thank you. One of the biggest, she's a very authoritative voice on media issues in the United States. She finds it interesting that, as you were saying, the Russian network was the only one to capture this.
I mean, look, it's really easy in this climate to see the hand of some nefarious Russian trolling network behind everything, but I'm afraid I do.
I tell you what I see.
It's a weird coincidence, isn't it? It's extremely strange that abruptly essentially a Russian.
But nothing alarms you about it.
Look, there's been quite a lot in the papers. Almost every day, a bit of another rumble about the Assange case, hasn't there?
Yeah.
And it just happens that the CNN was too dozy to be there. The BBC was too dozy. And actually, good for them.
But that's
whatever this
10
Russian
seconds worth of footage there.
Yeah.
And you'd have to have your cameras on the whole time, a live camera. It's also about the efficient use of
It's called
resources.
journalism, and once again, it's good journalism. A lively
That's very
journalism
expensive
by
running.
BBC.
I know you're from a newspaper, but to run a constant TV live camera with a crew is very expensive, and we make decisions all the time about that.
It was signalled days in advance that something was about to happen. You were too dozy to put a cameraman there. The BBC was too dozy. The rest of the world's press were too dozy. Well done, whatever this Russian channel. The idea that we've got two conspiracy theorists saying that something dodgy is going on.
He should be given a fair trial, is what Manaza says on Facebook. Do you think he will get a fair trial in the US if there is one?
Oh, sorry, in the UK, you look at the situation in the UK, where I slightly disagree with Zoe in terms of what's about to happen legally here, is that I think he probably will have quite a few allies and quite a few people in the legal community who take a view similar to Oborn's, which is, and I think they will pile in, and I think they will use everything, every legal tool possibly. Legitimately, I'm not criticising them. I think this will be long running, very difficult. I think where it's going to then get very difficult for the British government is that, and we still have to find out more about this extradition request from the US, is that once it's gone through the courts, it will come down to a government minister at some point, and that's the situation that Theresa May got herself into with Gary McKinnon, who was the extradition case that was blocked when she was Home Secretary.
This was the hacking case.
Yeah, so different case, but at some point, these very complex cases usually end up with some politician having to
make a judgment.
Name on a piece of paper.
We have heard from the Russian Foreign Ministry. Do you want to hear what they had to say? Ecuador has decided to refuse Assange asylum. President, that's from the British police, announced that Assange was taken under guard to a police station in central London. The hand of democracy squeezes the throat of freedom.
What?
That's from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Not,
What does that mean?
I don't know. Panel?
There's no knowing.
The hand of democracy squeezes, democracy in quotes, squeezes the throat of freedom.
Hand of democracy.
So what are they saying? That actually, if we didn't have a democracy, freedom would be better
I think
served?
they're questioning the level of democracy when you're squeezing the throat of freedom. I'm just trying to interpret.
I think they're making an argument for an authoritarian politics in which people never get arrested, which I think is exactly the kind of weird argument the Russian Foreign Office would make.
You don't agree?
It reminds me of that famous quote by Eric Cantona about
the seagulls
following the trawler.
Yeah.
It's mysterious. I think we'll leave it sort of out there in the ether.
No, Mick.
Chuck Waddy says he's concerned about the muzzling of free speech and the message it sends to despotic regimes, bringing the two together. And Karen says, send him home. It's the only chance of a fair trial that he'll receive.
Well, send him home to Australia.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
weird.
we haven't heard from the Australian Prime Minister,
Careful.
unless I'm mistaken, but we'll bring that to you as soon as we have it, of course, here on CNN. Ian's leaving us now, but the rest of the panel will remain, and we'll also speak to other reporters. We're with you until the top of the hour on this story. Thank you for watching.
Zuckerberg's thing. You didn't ask me about that. You rang me up. You said I was going on CNN. You didn't tell me about Facebook.
There is still
Disapprove
CNN.
of Facebook.
Still CNN's.
Have we got Atika's video? Can I run that first?
This will be like a dinner party.
I'm
We'll
going to
start
just say
bitching about
that,
you when
you
you've
know.
left.
Go for it.
Atika, word cloud.
About Brexit.
Okay.
We have a word cloud of all the comments. Ian, thank you.
Have we got a word cloud?
Yeah,
like
but I don't
a
know
word
what's in
cloud.
it, so we'll see what
Can I
happens.
have a look at my phone?
Yes.
As long as Facebook doesn't look
I'm
at
going to
my
have a look at my
messages.
Facebook already knows what your messages say.
Are you on Facebook?
No, I disapprove strongly of Facebook.
Yeah,
Until
yeah,
they
of course.
stop promoting unsavoury
Sorry.
causes, I'm going to go on.
Thank you. Oh.
Can I ring up? Can I make a telephone call? Well, when are we going?
We're
on
on,
now?
sorry, we're currently on Facebook
right
now.
Yeah.
Sorry?
We're on
the fact
Facebook
that
as
I'm
we
trying
speak.
to read
Right.
Just to clarify to everyone.
What's that?
Yeah.
Can you sit down again?
I'm completely clear on this.
You are?
Yeah, yeah.
So
I was
what
just
are you
looking on Twitter.
We've heard from the Swedish side of the story, which is from the lawyer from the woman who accused Assange of assault.
Oh, yeah.
She's saying, my client and I have just received the news that Assange has been arrested in London. It's understandably come as a shock to my client that what we've been waiting for and hoping since 2012 has now finally happened. what we've been waiting and hoping for since has finally happened. I mean, they wanted to see him released so he could face trial in Sweden, but they've dropped their extradition request.
So go on there.
They were hoping for him to leave.
To be honest, it's possible. If he were to be extradited anywhere, you'd much prefer to be extradited to Sweden than America.
Because of the system.
Because of the system and because the charges are different. You know, there's no treason charge.
Because again, there's sort of extradition treaties between Sweden and the US, which is the concern of WikiLeaks. But there is with the UK.
Yeah. I think he'd, you know, I mean, I keep trying to go back in time and make better decisions on Assange's behalf. But if you think about it, he's been self-imprisoned for 7 years. If he'd just gone to Sweden and faced the charges, he could have done that and been out
Wouldn't
in
it
3
be
years.
fascinating to see how he was living in that embassy? Presumably he was in one.
I sent a letter in
Really?
to go and see him. I sent it in about 3 days ago because I saw all this stuff which the BBC and CNN were too dozy to notice.
We need to have a live camera on every street corner.
And so I wrote a letter to the Ecuadorian embassy asking if I could go and see him.
Daily Mail was a bit dozy on that story as well, didn't you think? A bit dozy.
I mean, but unfortunately, I'm rather annoyed. I kind of never got that. I could have given you that description.
That would have been amazing if you had got in just before he was released.
Yeah.
It's a shame.
I know.
There's lots of
the story of my life. You're just missing one damn scoop after another,
Yeah.
But there we are.
Right, we're coming back to the TV show. We're going to show you the word cloud, and we're going to see the dominant words coming through the comments. Right, give a couple of comments first.
Is there a glass of water, do you think?
Water.
I sort of nicked, bless you, thank you very much. What's your name?
Max.
Max.
Yeah, I'm very famous.
I think you're famous.
I do, too.
Welcome back to CNN Talk. We're joined by a very cheeky Peter Oborne today. We thought you were the cheeky one, Lucy.
Zoe.
You've been out-cheeked. On Facebook, we're discussing Assange. He's been arrested today. Alvin says, I'm pro-freedom of speech and liberty, but Assange's acts have threatened the integrity of democracy globally. Anthony says, Assange seems to be the best check, though, on power-drunk leaders. Have a look at the word cloud. These are the most the most commonly used words appearing in the largest form on this word cloud. We can see what most people are saying. Free Assange, free speech. I don't know. Assange and free speech. Does that look like it? Hero's pretty big. And free Assange is a hashtag coming up big. Obviously, a lot of his fans are very big, aren't they, on digital and on social. So a lot of them will be homing in on this discussion on Facebook, which I know that you approve of, Peter.
That's quite interesting as well, that he did used to have a lot of very high-profile fans, and they've really dropped off. So, you know, as you say, he had that famous Lord.
They're speaking less, aren't they?
Yeah, they're speaking a lot less on his behalf, and I think that's because he sort of has become tarnished by his own personality.
On his personality, we'll show you a clip here. Atika Schubert was covering the Assange story for many years when she was here in London. She's now in Berlin, of course. This was her most famous moment with him, if I can call it that, and then we'll speak to her off the back of it. But let's have a look at the video.
This just came out. WikiLeaks. I love WikiLeaks.
This WikiLeaks stuff is unbelievable. Another one came in today. This WikiLeaks is like a treasure trove.
Oh. OK, he's not there. That's Donald Trump. It's going to come up, though. Donald Trump's linked to this story as well, as Lucy was explaining. Let's have the video we were looking for.
I'm not. What I'm asking is if you feel that it's an attack on WikiLeaks. Julian, I'm happy to go on to that route. In what sense? I have to ask that question.
So, Atika, that was, you know, you had worked quite closely with WikiLeaks on those early stories that Peter was talking about, and you got to know Julian Assange quite well, and then you had that moment, that famous moment that went viral, of course. Talk us through it and what you learned about Julian Assange as a character as a result.
Well, early on, of course, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange worked with a number of different media, including CNN. And that interview took place at the time that they had already published a number of the leaks that had come out, specifically from what we now know as Chelsea Manning having leaked those documents, those classified documents from the U.S. government. And just at that time, the Swedish allegations had come forward of sexual assault, and he was just learning about that at the time. And so in the interview, I asked him about the documents, but I also asked him about the Swedish allegations, and he did not want to answer the question, even though I said to him, look, do you see this as an attack on WikiLeaks, which he had said to me many times. At that point, he decided that that question was contaminating the interview, and that's when he got up and left. I did actually have a chance to interview him again when he went back, when he sought asylum in the Ecuador embassy. And inside, at the beginning stages, he seemed quite confident. And when I asked him what it was like to live in this room in the embassy without any windows, without any sunshine, he said it was like living in a spaceship. I don't think he had any idea at the time that he was going to be there for 7 years, however. And it's really hard to imagine what kind of a toll this has had on both his physical and his mental health.
Okay, Atika, thank you very much indeed. Naomi making the point, where's the Australian Foreign Minister today? He's an Australian national, isn't he? We've talked about that a bit.
Well, I mean, they don't really have much remit here. They couldn't pull him out, as far as I know. Could they, Peter?
I would have thought if he's an Australian national, they have quite a lot to say about it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, the unfortunate thing for Assange is that he has come out. You know, when he went in, the political order was relatively secure, and now he's come out, the political order is anything but secure. So you've got a very hard right government in Australia. You've got Trump, who makes wild, volatile decisions in America. So, you know, one minute he might be very pro-WikiLeaks, and the next minute he might be shouting treason. And then you've got Sajid Javid here, who, as we saw in the Shimon Bergen case, is happy to use anybody's life as a kind of political tool. So,
very nice point.
You know, it's very problematic, and I do feel for him on that level.
Yeah, I like that sort of Rip Van Winkle comparison.
Yeah. I mean, he does.
He sort
look
of went to
terrible,
bed
doesn't
and
he?
he wakes up 7 years.
Yeah,
the world's changed.
Sajid Javid said this today, nearly 7 years after entering the Ecuadorian embassy. I can confirm Julian Assange is now in police custody and rightly facing justice in the UK. I'd like to thank Ecuador for its cooperation and the Met Police for its professionalism. No one is above the law.
So what is he... did the Home Secretary saying what he's being charged with?
No, this was the first real confirmation we had this morning that he had been arrested, having seen what we did on Ruptley.
Yeah. I mean, look, Sajid Javid is in an interesting position because he's using everything at the moment for his own political capital, because obviously he's got leadership ambitions. So he's going to be making the call, what can I do to Julian Assange which will speak best to my base?
But presumably now this is much more a Foreign Office issue when we consider the extradition requests rather than the Sajid Javid area.
Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Prime Minister in the end of the day. I just think that there are grave issues here. This is the country of Wilkes and freedom. Wilkes was a very unsatisfactory character in many ways, but we had to fight for his freedom and his right to publish. And Assange is the Wilkes of
his day.
Of 2019.
It's a very generous comparison, I think. I mean, he doesn't seem to me to be... He seems to me to be quite wild. His judgment seems to be quite off.
OK, I've got an update for you from the Met Police. Julian Assange has today been further arrested on behalf of the United States authorities on arrival at the London police station. This is an extradition warrant under Section 73 of the Extradition Act. I don't know much about the sections. He'll appear in custody at Westminster Magistrates Court as soon as possible. Presumably that will have to be today to allow them to keep him.
And also, Max, it's literally 200 yards away. I mean, we could all go down there right now.
I think that's the first confirmation we've had that he's been arrested on behalf of the US authorities, effectively. Is that worrying to you?
Chilling. Chilling. And we have had these precedents of hackers, like the boy that we campaigned for so much at the Daily Mail. And what was his name? I was very proud of that campaign by the Mail, and I think we stopped it. You cannot trust US justice. It's vindictive. And you cannot allow them to set... We stand for principles of liberty and freedom of which Mr. Trump has no comprehension.
But the courts in the US would obviously separate themselves from the executive.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, the courts in the US are ultimately politically governed because
of the Supreme
president
Court.
chooses the Supreme Court. I mean, they're not in a good place to make impartial judgments which are seen to be impartial.
Let's hear from Nick Payton-Walsh. You've been following this story all morning. We've heard then that the extradition request from the US is confirmed.
Yes, absolutely. Under Section 73 of the Extradition Act of 2003. Now, that will presumably become part of the proceedings at Westminster Magistrates Court later on today. Obviously, I understand from a police source with knowledge of how these things work, I should say source of knowledge of how these things work, you normally book somebody into custody, then perhaps somebody in the physical condition of Julian Assange. You saw him looking quite dishevelled, frankly, there, whether by circumstance or purpose, as he was removed from the Ecuadorian embassy. He might well go through medical checks to be sure there's nothing enduringly wrong with him, and then he would appear before a magistrate, as you say, in Westminster Magistrates Court later on today. That extradition proceeding from the United States being part of that, something his lawyer, Jen Robinson, referred to in a tweet just over an hour ago now. And this throws the arrest and the coordination between Ecuadorian, United Kingdom and United States authorities very much under the spotlight here. And, of course, too, the extradition treaties, arrangements between the United States and United Kingdom. They have been the subject of substantial controversy in the past, partly because of the burden of proof required for both sides, often to enable somebody to be moved from one country to the other. And quite also, too, I think people will be asking exactly what the extradition request refers to, what specific charges are against him. We know from CNN reporting earlier this year and last that there are potentially issues they want to arrest or speak to him on. There's been other reports suggesting potentially charges too. This extradition request, I think, probably confirms the existence of some charges against Mr. Assange in the United States. But exactly what they are will be key, because that will be able to, I think, influence a judge's decision as to whether or not the extradition request should be honoured. You can probably guess that, given the volume of publicity, the high-profile nature of this case, it is probably unlikely that the Home Secretary, who was due to speak in about an hour and a half, maybe more, in front of the Houses of Parliament, I understand, presumably laying out more information about how this went down and what is to happen next. It is kind of unlikely they would enable these procedures to move forwards were they not under the belief that probably the extradition request itself might end up being successful. Obviously, under British law, that's a judge's decision, but of course the Home Office have their own lawyers and own experience of how these things have gone down in the past. So obviously somebody of Julian Assange's prominence, whatever decision the courts make will be viewed through different political lenses here. But I have to say, you know, you could kind of get the feeling he probably thought this was coming. Not an accident that his colleagues laid out such a barrage of allegations against the Ecuadorian embassy in a press conference yesterday. Probably not an accident that a man who's managed to shave and keep himself quite well together over the past years suddenly grew a massive beard and began to look extraordinarily weak, not choosing to walk out of that embassy at all in the images we saw. And so I think we're in possibly for more, you might unkindly say, theatre in the weeks or months ahead as the extradition request plays out. The speed in which the UK deals with this, though, will be key, as will the judges' decisions in the days ahead, Max.
OK, Nick, thank you. We've heard from Assange's US attorney, Barry Polak. He says he hopes the UK will give Mr. Assange access to proper healthcare, which he's been denied for 7 years. But more poignantly, he's saying there's been an unprecedented effort by the United States to seek to extradite a foreign journalist to face criminal charges for publishing truthful information. Is that a fair accusation?
I mean, yeah, sure. Of course, you'll make that defence. I don't think you could. I don't think, as his lawyer, you wouldn't say this was journalism and nobody should be prosecuted for journalism. The argument,
is it journalism?
Look, the argument is
yes. Ultimately, it's about free speech. There's no issue about that. You mustn't call that into question. It's the case that he published all kinds of cables which we would have given Zoe, me, you, CNN, BBC, our eye teeth to get hold of.
I mean, look, I'm really
Truth-telling is the right word.
I'm really conflicted about this because actually, especially the interference in the US election, it was incredibly damaging. It really did blow out of all proportion the Hillary Clinton's stuff. The FBI fixated on her when there were much more damaging accusations against the Trump camp.
So you don't think it was
the
helpful?
FBI, though?
Well, sort of. But I mean, you know, I don't think it's as simple as this is a free speech issue, you must defend free speech. You have actual governments mischievously interfering in other countries' elections with the explicit support of people like Assange. And you have to say, we're in a new world. Do we want to examine it closely, or do we want to just judge it by the
Can I
old
just tell you
world?
something? This is a very point. The United States of America is notorious for interfering
I know.
on an industrial scale in other countries' elections. And now you're trying to sort of put up some kind of defence of the United States trying to extradite a journalist. You are a mess. You're a mess. You're an intellectual shambles. Well, I mean,
I've got to let you respond to
Well, no,
that.
I mean, I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? It's like if these are complicated questions and you can't reach answers by having very binary positions.
If you're
which you then
going to arrest somebody for interfering in somebody else's elections, you can start off with the head of the CIA and go downwards. I mean,
Peter, that's a massive oversimplification of my position, as you well know.
But we'll talk about it more after the break.
Yeah,
How about that? It's not easy with that heckling, either, is it, from behind?
I know, but actually, it's nice.
I love Zoe's analysis. Honest and measured, says Lorraine. You're developing fans. There's lots of Assange fans as well on Facebook. We're going to be speaking, I think, after the break to Alan Duncan as well. What sort of questions would you like to hear him answer?
Bloody hell. I mean, what's Alan Duncan got to say about this?
He's
He
Foreign
is
Office Minister.
For that region, for the Americas, I think, is
But
part of his brief.
he won't be able to tell us what Sajid Javid's going to... I mean,
Well,
that's
we'll
what we
find
need
out.
to know, right?
Yes.
Let's ask him what charges exactly, why the Americans want him.
Yeah.
What does he accept that this is a free speech issue? We should ask him that.
But presumably that's the basis of the extradition request. That, you know, it is, isn't it? Because it's leaked information that was classified, presumably. Thanks for your comments. There is a lot of support for Julian Assange, which I'm not saying is surprising, but you know, quite often when you hear negative comments, so if Ian says something negative, you'll get a lot of people coming from the other side.
Yeah, no, I don't think... I mean, I'm surprised by how much support there is for him.
So it's Alan Duncan, yeah, he's in Westminster.
Does he believe in free speech? Question number one.
From the Daily Mail, care of, via CNN.
Question number two.
Very complex.
Does he jump when the US... And question number three is...
Coming to the TV show. Julian Assange, big headline here in London. He was arrested this morning, and we've just understood from the London police, the Metropolitan Police, that there is he's been arrested in part on effectively on behalf of the US authorities. There's an extradition request in form. We can speak to Alan Duncan, who's a Foreign Office Minister now. Thank you for joining us. Can you give us any more detail on what this extradition request is based on?
No, because it's played no part in our discussions with the Ecuador government in order to bring an end to Julian Assange staying in one room for over 7 years. So our part, as the Foreign Office, has been to try and bring to a conclusion his self-imposed incarceration, and that's what we've managed to do this morning. In terms of any kind of arrest or extradition requirement or request, that's entirely a matter for the law. It's not a matter for us who are politicians in the Foreign Office.
So you've had no communications from the State Department on anything in relation to this?
No, my communications have been with the Ecuador government under President Moreno, who was getting increasingly frustrated and annoyed by this going on and on and on, and also by the conduct of Julian Assange, and also from just a basic human level. I mean, someone just staying in one room for 7 years is going to face a lot of health pressures. And it was quite clear to us that his health was deteriorating. And so we wanted to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. And so we have gone through all the proper processes in doing that. And I think the police have conducted a really excellent operation this morning in the way they did this. We're grateful, too, to the ambassador here and our ambassador in Quito. So our role as the Foreign Office has been the diplomatic engagement which has been required to bring this sorry saga to an end.
I find it extraordinary, though, that aware that Washington is so concerned about Julian Assange and that they wanted him to face trial over there, that you haven't had any conversations with them about this ahead of the arrest.
Well, you can continue to find it extraordinary because you need to appreciate that the law is for the law and political things and diplomacy are for politicians, and we do not interfere in the process of the law. The only respect in which we have restated our policy is that we don't extradite anybody to a country where the death penalty might be used in the absence of proper written assurances. So that, of course, is our stated policy. It's not just one for Julian Assange, it's one for everybody. So everybody knows that Julian Assange is a controversial figure, so that kind of restatement of policy has been an obvious thing to state.
Would ministers get involved in any sort of adjudication then on this extradition request when it comes into you? If it does blow up into a big issue of freedom of speech, as my fellow panellists suggest it would do, would you get involved at that point, and what would your call be on it?
No, it's a matter for the law, and certainly it's not a matter for the Foreign Office. The Home Secretary will make a statement this afternoon and no doubt face questions along those lines. But it is not for me in the Foreign Office really to opine or interfere on any issue that is a proper matter for the course of the law, because our law is separate from political interference.
OK, Alan, thank you very much indeed. Alan Duncan, MP, he did have to go. We have to move on from it. But what was your response to that?
Well, he's playing a straight bat, and that's what he's employed to do. There is, however, a record of the British government interfering in extradition requests, so it's not just a matter for the law.
Yeah.
I was just about to want to come in and ask him that question, because there are precedents where we get involved. So,
was he projecting that onto the Home Office, though, as opposed to his department? What was his...
Well, I mean, I saw him as in that case, as a government representative.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it probably is more of the... I'm trying to remember in the McKinnon case, was it the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary?
Well, Theresa May was at that point Home Secretary, so she did intervene, but it wasn't a prime ministerial brief at that point. But I can't remember why not.
What were your thoughts as a result of that interview?
Well, look, I mean, it didn't tell us anything, was my thought, and that's that's the straight bat, isn't it? That he didn't tell us anything. He just said it was a kind of process for the law, and it's perfectly, there's no. The UK government doesn't have to OK the Americans to put in extradition charges. So it's not as though we have already bowed down to their demands, So we may well, and I wouldn't be surprised if we did, but at this point, all we've done is accept their extradition charge.
Well, until we hear from Washington or from some lawyers in the United States, we're not going to know what the basis of this extradition request is until he appears, possibly, Issa, at Westminster Magistrates Court, which is where you are now. What are you looking out for there?
I've been inside to Court 1. That's where we're expecting him to appear in roughly about 2 hours, anytime from 2 o'clock, in fact. That's what I've been told in the last couple of minutes. And then what we'll wait to hear inside is whether he will be told of his charge, whether that's espionage. But we expect what we'll hear, first of all, is whether he will have skipped bail, whether he will be charged for skipping bail, which is a relatively low offence compared to what we're hearing in terms of the extradition requests coming from the United States. Lots for the court to consider after that. I got off the phone a few minutes ago with a US and UK lawyer who deals with extradition requests, and he was basically saying, look, this is as much as political as it is a legal process, and the court will have to look at the grounds whether, if he's extradited, is there a death penalty? Is this a political act? This is something the court will also look at as well. Is there reasonable grounds of guilt? The court will have all the documents at their disposal to reach that decision. But then ultimately, it is the Home Office, the British government, Sajid Javid, will decide whether or not to extradite him. Max?
OK, we just heard from the Foreign Office as well. Foreign Secretary saying what is not acceptable is for someone to escape facing justice. And he's tried to do that for a very long time. And that's why he's not a hero. So whatever...
That was the Foreign Secretary's statement.
As he was extraordinary. I can't vouchsafe whether what I'm going to say is true, but this is what a spokesman for...
Yeah.
No, it's just a case made by the defence. I just don't know enough about it. The case made by people close to Assange is he would willingly have gone to Sweden at a moment's notice to face these charges, which he denied, I believe. However, he could never get assurances he would not be extradited to the United States.
But how could they ever give that?
Well, but on the other hand, he couldn't go without those assurances because he says that if he goes, he's in the United States, that's that. He's in a cell.
But Max is right, though. I mean, the kind of process of refusing an extradition process cannot begin until the extradition...
Can't preempt it, yeah.
Exactly. So they could never have given him that assurance without actually starting a war with America.
Right, but nevertheless, it was a reasonable point. So if he couldn't get a guarantee that he was going to not going to be extradited, he couldn't go to Sweden. I could see that. That's why he was holed up in this place for 7 years.
Fred on Facebook is waiting for Trump's tweets on this. See, normally Trump's tweets this hour. He hasn't done so far. I'm not convinced he will, because I'm not sure it necessarily works for his base.
He's not a very discretion is the better part of valour president, is he? So if he's not saying anything, it's because he's going to make a decision which contradicts his earlier statements.
We will be bringing what Fox News says about it.
We'll see. We will be following all of this for you throughout the day. Do listen again to the debate as well. The fiery arguments that have been had. Go to Apple Podcasts, look up CNN Talk. Thank you for watching. We'll be back in just a moment with the latest update for you.